Hey, grade fives. Good to see you again. I hope you had a fantastic week off there. A great time celebrating Easter with your family. And I hope you had a bunch of fun, as much fun as you can have when you're in quarantine. Anyway, so we officially start our new unit on measurement, and this is going to be a week-long series. Now, before Easter break, I gave you an assignment where I asked you a few questions. One of the questions was like, "What do you hope to learn through this unit on shapes and space?" And a few of you responded, "What do shapes have to do with math?" Because for you, like math deals with numbers and not shapes. But yeah, so we're gonna talk about measurement to this week, and then next week we're gonna start talking a little bit more about shapes. And what you're gonna notice about shapes is that we're gonna be measuring our shapes. We're gonna be measuring their dimensions, and so that's where the numbers come into play when we're dealing with shapes. All right. Before we do that, though, I do need to teach you a little bit about measurement. So your learning goal for today looks like this. I can choose the most appropriate unit to measure a chosen object. So let's just get some flowing through your brain right now. I'm going to ask you this question just to get you warmed up. When have you ever had to measure something? All right. Now, I've got a couple pictures on here. You have probably measured your own height. I know with my children, we've got little wood boards screwed to the walls in their bedrooms. And every year on their birthday, we just kind of back them up to that board and we put a little tick with their current height. And that way we can get a record of how tall they are every year. And hopefully they're growing. My daughter, not so much. My son, yeah, he's growing a bit. So that's one example of where maybe you've had to measure something. Maybe you've measured your own height. And I know for sure a couple months ago in science class when we were working on our Nerf gun projects and our fan powered cars and those projects there, I know that there was a little bit of measurement involved with that as well. Some of you had to use rulers or measuring tapes to make that project happen as well. So those are just a few examples of where you've maybe had to measure something in your own life. What tools have you ever used to measure length? So I've put a couple tools on here that you would be familiar with. Yeah, a ruler, and then over on the right-hand side, we've got a tape measure. These are really common in the construction world. So if you were framing houses or building things, cabinets or whatever, you would probably have one of these at your side at all times. Down in the bottom left-hand corner, we've got meter sticks, and I know back at the school in my classroom, I had a couple of these lying around too, so you've probably seen these. And these are called measuring tapes, not tape measures like up here, but measuring tapes. And a lot of times I've seen these used in like fashion, the fashion industry. So anytime somebody's like measuring somebody's waist because they want to make them a pair of pants, or in the fitness industry too. If you want to measure like how big your muscles are, you would use a measuring tape like this because they're flexible and they're easy to wrap around. So I could wrap it around my arm to measure how big my muscles are or how small they are in my case. So those are some really common tools used for measuring things. And then in the middle here, I've got two that are common, but maybe you didn't think of them. So when you're driving in your car, there's some numbers displayed right below your speedometer. And these numbers here are called your odometer, and this measures how far your car has been driven in total. So when they roll a car off of a production line, this would read 0 kilometers here in Canada. And then as you drive it, this number just keeps growing and growing. And every kilometer you drive, it just increases by one for that. So this is for measuring maybe bigger distances, for measuring kilometers, whereas these other tools that you'd be more familiar with are for measuring things like papers and pieces of wood and stuff. And then down at the bottom here, these are called calipers, and maybe you saw me bring these in when we were working on our Nerf gun project. These help you measure how far are the distance across a pipe or something round, a tube or something like that. Because it's really hard to get an accurate reading just by holding a ruler up to something round. So these calipers, they spread apart and then you can actually span them across the distance of the tube. And then they give you a really accurate reading for how, like the diameter or the distance across. So those are just a few tools that you might want to be familiar with here. Um, and when we move on, we're going to talk about some different units now. What units have you used to measure length? And as I read through these, I want you to think about like how many of these words are you familiar with? Millimeters, centimeters, miles, meters, cubits, inches, kilometers, feet, light years, and micrometers, or some people might pronounce that micrometers. So you've probably heard of a few of those, but maybe some of the lesser known ones, cubits. In the Bible, when God was telling Noah how to build the ark, he gave Noah measurements in cubits. And cubits, I think, are fairly similar in size to a foot, but I'm not certain on that. But if you've never heard of that, that's where that comes from. Light years, that's also maybe not a very common one. The reason that you may not have heard of a light year is because we don't actually use that to measure distances here on Earth. Light years are used to measure incredibly large distances out in space. And so later on in high school, and if you ever go to university or college and study astronomy, we measure distances to stars or distances to galaxies, other galaxies in our universe using light years. So this is an incredibly long unit of measure, not practical for things of this Earth. And then the last one here I want to talk about is micrometers. And these ones are incredibly small. This is the distances that we're talking if we're measuring like structures within the cells in our body or atoms or very tiny things that we can't see with our eyes. So very, very small units there. Okay, so why do we have like 10 different units, 10 or 15 different units that we can choose from when we're measuring things? And to answer that question, we actually have to teach you one other thing here. There's actually two different systems that we use in our world for measuring things. The first system, and the one that we're going to spend a majority of our time learning in school, is called the metric system. This is the system that pretty much the entire world uses to measure things. And if you look at this map I've included on the bottom here, all of these countries that are green use the metric system. Okay, so you can see by and large most of the world's on that system. But we do have a second system in the world called the imperial system. And this is the system that mostly like the United States uses to measure things. Okay, so you can see here on the map, here's the United States, and then of course Alaska up here is part of the United States as well. And then if you look really closely, you can see over here on the west coast of Africa, there's one country, and then in Southeast Asia, there's a country, and then there's a few island nations out here in the Pacific Ocean that use that as well. Not very commonly used around the world, but because the United States is such an influential nation around the world, unfortunately, that means that we kind of have to learn that as well because that's the system they use and they aren't willing to change it. So with the metric system, each unit of measure increases by a factor of 10, which means that like a centimeter is made up of 10 millimeters, and a decameter is made up of 10 centimeters. And so everything just kind of increases by a scale of 10. With the American system, it's really hard to explain. And I'm not even going to attempt that right now, okay? So knowing that there's two systems that our world uses, that may help us to understand why we have so many different units to choose from. So what I've done is I've broken up all of these words that I had on my word wall. And under the metric system, you'll see there's millimeters, centimeters, decimeters, meters, decameters, hectometers, and kilometers. And the one thing that you'll notice about all these is they all end in the word meter, which is actually the same root word as metric. So that makes it really easy to identify if you're using a metric unit of measure because it ends in meter. And then imperial units, that would be like fractions of an inch, inches, a foot, or feet, yards, and miles. Okay. Now you can use like if I was to measure the length of this pen here, I would, if I was using the metric system, I would probably use centimeters to measure the length here. If I was an American using the imperial system, I would probably measure the length of my pen in inches. All right. So you can kind of see that they have similar places here. And to help you visualize that a bit more, I've actually put a ruler on the bottom of this slide. And the ruler has inches along the bottom, and it has centimeters or I guess a metric scale along the top edge here. And so you can see that a millimeter, like in between my 6 and my 7 here, you'll see 10 littler or smaller markings on the ruler, and each of those is a millimeter. And those are kind of comparable in size to the small little markings on the ruler between the 9 and the 10 inches. 9 and the 10 inches. And these are called fractions of an inch here. So those are interchangeable. We can use millimeters, we can use fractions of an inch to measure things of like a similar size, all right? And then you can also see that centimeters are kind of interchangeable with inches. So if I wanted to measure my pen, I could use centimeters here. I could use inches if I was an American. In Canada we use meters, and in America they use yards. And again, those are very similar, about kind of the wingspan of an average kid. A smaller kid maybe would be about a meter or a yard. And then, of course, for measuring bigger distances, if I was trying to measure the distance from Red Deer to Calgary, I would use kilometers. And if I was American, I would use miles for that. Okay, so that's all I have to say about the two systems. Just knowing the difference between the two systems and that different units belong to different systems. Okay, so I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier, that with the metric system, all of our units are just growing by a factor of 10. So 10 millimeters in a centimeter. They don't have the unit of a decimeter in here, but if they did, there would be 10 centimeters in a decimeter. But then there's 10 decimeters in a meter. And so that pattern just with the imperial system, like I said, I'm not going to blow up your minds trying to explain that. Just know it's really confusing, but you'll learn that in grade 8. Okay. All right. The last thing I want to talk about today before I give you your assignment is using body parts to estimate the length of things in centimeters and meters. And so your baby finger, your pinky here, is roughly 1 centimeter. And if you hold out your arms, kind of like my little guy here, 1 meter isn't from like fingertip to fingertip. It's actually probably closer to, let me just get a marker here. It's probably closer to like your wrist to your wrist. So the wrist on your left hand to the wrist on your right hand, if you hold your arm straight out. That's roughly a meter. But again, that's going to probably depend on how tall you are and how wide your wingspan is. But those are rough estimates. So what we want to do today for an assignment is I want to send you out to measure a few distances or estimate a few distances using body parts. So your activity for today is, the first activity is to measure the width of your door frame in centimeters. And so behind me here, I'm just going to stand up and re-angle. You can see that I've got a door behind me. Now, you're in grade 5. You're probably not as tall as me, because if I was going to do this, I'd probably go stand in my door and use my pinky to measure up here. Because you probably can't safely reach that high, what I'm going to recommend that you do is go hang out in your door frame, and then you can crouch down and just stack your fingers side by side and see how many finger widths across your door frame is. And then you can send me your answer in an email, or you can comment on this assignment as well. That would be acceptable. So that's part 1 of your assignment, is just to measure the width of your door frame or estimate it using your pinky. And then the second part of your assignment is to estimate the length of a bed or a couch in your house. Pinkies are probably not a practical thing to measure that distance in. You're going to be counting for a long time. So a more practical unit would be meters. So now we're going to use our arm lengths, and you're just going to go give me a rough estimate. Maybe it's 2 arm lengths or 2 meters wide. Maybe it's 3. So you can go take that measurement. And again, just send me that number in an email or comment in your assignment. So there's your lesson for today, guys. We will see you back here tomorrow, where we learn a little bit more about measurement. All right, have a good day.